Soviet forces had already begun a careful redeployment for the next major offensive. Planned for January 1945, this would be the final all-out assault that would take the Red Army into the very heart of Hitler's Reich.
On taxes, who's on your side? John McCain pledges hundreds of billions in corporate tax breaks, billions for oil companies. But for 100 million households, nothing. And McCain's health plan would tax benefits for the first time ever.
To Joseph Stalin, Berlin was the prize desired above all others. As the last refuge of Hitler, the capture of the Reich's capital would be the greatest possible symbol of victory. Stalin profoundly distrusted the Western Allies and was certain they would make a dash for Berlin at the first opportunity, in spite of their assurances. To mislead the Americans, he even claimed that Berlin had lost its significance and that the main target of the last Soviet offensive would be the city of Dresden. In fact, Stalin considered the capture of Berlin so important, he bypassed not just the Stavka, his political military council, but also the Army General Staff. Eventually, in the final stages, he himself would take command of military operations. Unlike Hitler, Stalin was usually prepared to accept the advice of his generals. He had a highly flexible and retentive mind, well suited to military affairs, and often took over briefings from commanders not showing sufficient mastery of their material. At Allied summits throughout the war, the Soviet dictator deeply impressed British and American leaders with his thorough understanding of logistics. Even with his most senior commanders, Stalin was supremely devious and manipulative. While he ordered his generals to cooperate with each other, he also contrived to spur them on by encouraging deep and bitter rivalries. At Stalin's instigation, the final drive on Berlin would be turned into a race in which commander would be pitted against commander. That the result would be a reckless expenditure of Russian lives was, to Stalin, a matter of supreme indifference. On July the 20th, 1944, a bomb had been planted in the conference room of Adolf Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The blast had killed 4 men, but by an amazing turn of luck, Hitler had escaped with minor injuries to his legs and arms. Within hours, the first of thousands of arrests had been made. Even before the attempt on his life, Hitler's relationship with his generals had been stormy, but now he became utterly paranoid. Dependent on cocktails of drugs prescribed by his personal physician, Hitler grew increasingly disturbed, unstable, and prone to violent fits of temper. The gulf between the Führer and his generals was now so great that all meaningful communication had virtually ceased. Hitler took personal control of even the minutest aspect of military operations, and his constant refrain was no withdrawal. The General Staff, desperate to gain room for operational maneuver, still the great strength of the German army, was viewed by Hitler as a collection of weak-willed and cowardly incompetents who refused to stand and fight. Hitler's response to any show of initiative in the field was to sack the offender unceremoniously. In the last 6 months of 1944, the entire army leadership on the Eastern Front had been replaced for one failing or another. The result was a complete collapse of confidence amongst senior German commanders. Many resigned, exasperated beyond endurance. The rest could do little more than stand humiliated on the sidelines, while the German armed forces and Germany itself was led to the brink of catastrophe. November 1944, the Soviet General Staff had outlined its plan for the greatest campaign in military history. The offensive would span the entire length of the Eastern Front, and fighting would take place in 8 different countries. In spite of the gigantic scale of the planned offensive, the Red Army estimated it would take just 45 days to achieve its objective, the capture of Berlin, the city that Stalin had called the lair of the fascist beast. Unusually, Stalin did not invite his front commanders to a conference where operations and tactics would be discussed. Instead, each was summoned in turn and given his operational area and his objectives. There were to be no arguments and no compromises. The Soviet offensive was timetabled for the 20th of January 1945. This would give enough time for winter to freeze the notoriously wet Polish roads, and by then, fog would be less of a problem for the Air Force. Meanwhile, the great build-up would commence. Red Army reserves were increased all along the front, and supplies and equipment stockpiled for the operations to come. In preparation, a great propaganda offensive was begun. The Red Army was to be primed for its sweep into Germany by instilling in its ranks the deepest hatred of the German Wehrmacht and people. With the Red Army only 300 miles from Berlin, a distance the Russians were capable of advancing in as little as 5 weeks, it was obvious to the German High Command that the plight of the capital was desperate. German intelligence calculated that the Soviet attack would begin around January the 12th, and that the enemy enjoyed an advantage of 11-1 in infantry, 7-1 in tanks, and 20-1 in guns. Hitler dismissed these estimates as rubbish. No reinforcements would be sent east from the Western Front, nor would German forces trapped in the Courland Peninsula be evacuated by sea to shore up the defenses in the central sector. In Hitler's words, the Eastern Front must take care of itself. The result was an absolute dependence on fixed defensive lines, and for months, tens of thousands of civilians had been toiling to transform the Reich into one vast fortress. The will to fight was, the Nazi leadership believed, the key to survival for the shattered remnants of the Third Reich. The population, military and civilian, must be made to believe that in defeat they would be given no quarter. For most, there was little difficulty imagining the fate that would befall them at the hands of vengeful Russians. But the West, too, had added fuel to the fire of German resolve. Almost ceaseless bombing of the Reich cities had already left many in ruins, and in the summer of 1944, an Allied plan had been discussed which seemed to promise no mercy for the German people. Germany was to be divided permanently. Huge swathes of territory were to be given to the Soviet Union, Poland, France, and Denmark. All her surviving heavy industry was to be dismantled, and Germany was to be returned to a medieval state of small farmers and a subsistence economy. The plan was supported by Roosevelt, but strongly opposed by Churchill, and was soon dropped. However,